The city's skyline gleamed under the pale winter sun, casting long shadows over the streets below. Inside a high-rise on the top floor, Ethan Harris sat behind a massive oak desk, staring out at the cold expanse. The office, once a symbol of his success, now felt empty, its polished floors and sleek furniture mocking his downfall. His tailored suit, impeccable in appearance, could not hide the exhaustion that weighed on him. The phone on his desk had been silent for days. No more calls from partners or invitations to exclusive events. His company, Harris Investments, was crumbling under the weight of debt, lawsuits, and scandals. The headlines in the media said it all. Harris Investments in crisis, once a giant, now a fallen star. Ethan clenched his jaw and scrolled through his inbox. It was a wasteland of demands, threats, and notices from banks and former allies who had cut ties. The knock on the door broke his thoughts. Without waiting for permission, David Ford, his longtime friend and business partner, stepped into the room. Ethan didn't need to look up. He knew the sound of David's footsteps too well. "You look like hell," David remarked, his voice carrying a mix of sympathy and something else. Ethan barely lifted his eyes. "I feel worse," he replied, his voice low and hollow. David hesitated before speaking again. "Tell me you have something. Anything. Is there any way to pull us out of this?" Ethan's heart sank. "We've exhausted every option," David continued, his voice too calm for the situation. "The debts are too deep, the investors are circling, and no one's willing to bail us out." Ethan clenched the armrest, his knuckles whitening. "So that's it? We just let everything burn?" David's gaze faltered for a moment. Then he sighed. "Sometimes you can't win every battle." The room felt suffocating. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Get out," he said coldly. "Just get out." David lingered for a moment, but said nothing. He retreated, and the door clicked shut behind him. Silence followed, heavy and oppressive. Ethan slammed his fist onto the desk in frustration, papers flying in every direction. The man who had once commanded boardrooms now stood defeated in his own office. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and walked out, ignoring the concerned looks from his secretary. He stepped into the elevator, heading down to the lobby. The cool air outside felt like a brief respite, but it wasn't enough to shake the heaviness that had settled in his chest. He got into his sleek black car and drove aimlessly, the city blurring around him. High-rises gave way to worn apartment blocks, and neon signs flickered over shuttered stores. His thoughts churned until a figure caught his eye at a traffic light, a boy darting between cars. Ethan initially thought the boy was another street hustler, but something about him stood out. His thin frame, worn clothes, and sharp, focused eyes made Ethan pause. The boy approached the car and began cleaning the windshield without a word. When he finished, Ethan rolled down the window and handed him some crumpled bills. "You're Ethan Harris," the boy said, his voice steady and direct. Ethan froze. "Yeah," he replied, confused. "You're losing everything," the boy stated calmly. "I know how to help." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "And what's it to you?" he snapped. The boy looked him square in the eyes. "My mom tried to stop what's killing your company, but you fired her." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Your mother?" he asked slowly. "Sarah Carter," the boy replied. "She was your analyst. You called her a thief." Recognition hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Sarah Carter. He remembered her. Bright, meticulous, fired under a cloud of accusations. He had trusted David's judgment, and now everything was falling apart. The boy's eyes remained locked on his. "I can help you," he said simply. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Ethan's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his thoughts racing as the boy slid into the passenger seat. The scent of the street lingered with him, a mix of cold air and faint exhaust fumes. For a moment, the world outside felt distant, a blur of city lights and flickering signs. But inside the car, everything was different. The boy, Jake Carter, sat still, his dark eyes scanning the road ahead. There was no fear in him, just a quiet confidence that unnerved Ethan. "You're telling me your mom, Sarah Carter, was right?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "She tried to warn me, but I fired her." Jake nodded once, his gaze steady. She knew what was going on, but you didn't listen. She had the numbers, the proof. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened further, the edges of his mind beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. She was accused of embezzlement, fraud. My company couldn't survive that scandal. But now you're telling me she was right? Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked to the side, watching the city pass by. He seemed almost too calm for someone so young. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made Ethan uneasy. The boy wasn't just some street kid. He knew something. "You need to listen to me," Jake said, his voice unshaken. "David Ford, your partner, he was behind it all. He turned your company upside down, and now he's working with Gordon Foster, your biggest rival. They've been working together to tear down Harris Investments. They knew exactly what they were doing." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "David? But he's been my closest friend for years. He helped me build this company. Why would he destroy everything?" Jake's expression remained unchanged. "He did it for the money. It was never about loyalty. David's been taking advantage of you for years. And now Foster, he's ready to step in and take everything you've built." The weight of Jake's words pressed down on Ethan like a suffocating fog. David, the man he had trusted more than anyone else, had been secretly working to ruin him? The realization was like a cold slap to the face. "Where is your mom now?" Ethan asked, trying to steady his thoughts. "Where can I find Sarah?" Jake turned to look at him, his gaze sharp. "She's been living off the radar since you fired her. You won't find her in your typical circles. But I know where she is. I can take you to her." Ethan felt the urge to reject it, to dismiss this whole encounter as a delusion from a desperate kid. But something in Jake's calm demeanor, his unwavering confidence, made Ethan hesitate. Maybe this was the last chance he had to save his company. Maybe this boy knew something he didn't. "Fine," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "Take me to her." Jake's eyes flashed with something resembling approval. "We can fix this, but it won't be easy." As they drove through the city, the contrast between Ethan's sleek black car and the rundown neighborhoods they passed grew starker. The once pristine roads now gave way to cracked pavement and faded storefronts. The closer they got to their destination, the more Ethan felt the unease settling in. They stopped in front of an old weathered building, the windows clean, but the exterior worn by years of neglect. It stood in sharp contrast to the polished world Ethan was used to. Jake opened the door without a word and led Ethan up a narrow, dimly lit staircase. At the third floor, they stopped in front of a small apartment door. Jake knocked twice, quickly and firmly. After a moment, the door opened. Inside stood Sarah Carter, her face lined with years of hardship, but her eyes as sharp as ever. "Ethan Harris," she said, her voice cold but not surprised. "It's been a while." Ethan swallowed hard. He had no words at first, only a tight nod. "Come in," Sarah said, stepping aside to let him through. As Ethan entered, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this reunion, would be the beginning of something much bigger than he ever imagined. The apartment was small, simple, but it had a sense of order. The furniture was worn but meticulously arranged, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with titles on finance, economics, and law. A stark contrast to the disarray Ethan had left behind in his own world of high-rises and boardrooms. Sarah Carter stood by the door, her eyes assessing him. Despite the years, there was still a sharpness to her gaze, a keen intelligence that never seemed to fade. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but edged with something colder than the last time he'd seen her. "Come in, Ethan. I'm curious. What brings you here after all this time?" Ethan hesitated, taking in the apartment, the woman standing in front of him, and the boy, Jake, who had silently followed him inside. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to feel so out of place. The harsh reality of his situation hit him again, stronger than before. "You're right, it's been a while," Ethan said slowly, his throat tight. He cleared his voice. "But things have changed. I've learned something about my company, something I should have seen before." Sarah didn't respond right away. She only gestured to the worn armchair across from her. Ethan sat down, but his body felt stiff, like he was still in some kind of shock. "I'm listening," Sarah said after a pause. "What happened to Harris Investments?" Ethan's eyes flickered briefly to Jake, who was sitting on the arm of a nearby chair, watching intently. Jake's presence made Ethan uneasy, but he pushed that aside, focusing on what he had come here to hear. "I made a mistake," Ethan admitted, his voice rough. "I trusted the wrong people. I trusted David Ford. He's been my closest friend and business partner for years, but now my company is on the brink of collapse, and I'm starting to realize he's behind it all. I've been blinded by loyalty." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Ethan saw the briefest flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew. She'd always known. "He's been siphoning money from the company for months, hasn't he?" Ethan continued, his words gaining strength. "David and Gordon Foster, my competitor, they've been working together to take down Harris Investments from the inside." Sarah's eyes narrowed, and she sat down across from him. "It's worse than that, Ethan." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had expected the betrayal to be deep, but he hadn't anticipated this. David didn't just want to destroy the company. He's been embezzling funds, covering his tracks by using shell companies. But you weren't the only one he targeted. He needed someone to blame for the mess. Someone who could take the fall for everything he did. Ethan's breath caught. "You. He blamed you," he said, the realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. "He used you as a scapegoat." Sarah nodded, her expression colder than ever. "He needed to discredit me. I uncovered what he was doing, found the financial discrepancies. But when I flagged them, David turned on me. He accused me of fraud. And you believed him. You fired me without a second thought." Ethan's stomach churned. He remembered the day she was fired, the accusations, the scandal. It had been quick, too quick. And now, with Sarah sitting in front of him, it all seemed so clear. "I should have looked at the reports," Ethan muttered. "I should have questioned it." "You didn't," Sarah said bluntly. "You trusted David more than the numbers, more than me." Ethan winced at the truth in her words. "But I didn't know. I didn't see it." "You were blind," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "And now your company is crumbling because of it." Jake shifted on the arm of the chair, his eyes still fixed on Ethan. "We need to fix this, Ethan. We need to expose David and Foster. They've been planning this for too long." Ethan's mind raced. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, destroyed because of one man's greed, and it was his fault for not seeing it sooner. He turned to Sarah, his voice low but resolute. "How do we bring them down?" Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time since their reunion, there was a flicker of something like trust in her eyes. "We gather the proof, the real proof, not just the numbers, but the people who can testify, and we make sure David and Foster can't escape the truth." Ethan felt a surge of determination flood through him. This wasn't over. Not yet. The battle had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of tension and determination. Ethan barely slept, his mind constantly whirling with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. He could feel the weight of his company's collapse pressing on him with every passing hour. But now, with Sarah Carter and Jake at his side, he had a new purpose: exposing the men who had destroyed him. Sarah had already started compiling evidence: hidden accounts, suspicious transactions, and discrepancies in the company's books. She worked relentlessly, her focus razor-sharp. Ethan had to admit he had never fully appreciated her brilliance until now. She was meticulous, uncovering the skeletons that David had hidden so carefully in the dark corners of the business world. In the meantime, Jake kept a low profile. Though still a young teenager, he had shown an uncanny ability to gather information, to observe the smallest details that others overlooked. He had been part of this world in ways that Ethan hadn't fully grasped. Jake had seen his mother's fall from grace and had learned from it. He knew how the system worked, how to exploit its weaknesses. Ethan, on the other hand, had a different task at hand. He needed to solidify their case. He reached out to Albert Vlasov, a private investigator who had a reputation for uncovering the most well-hidden secrets. Vlasov had worked with Ethan in the past, though he had always been on the periphery of Ethan's world. Now he was invaluable. Vlasov was thorough. He quickly uncovered more damning evidence, connecting David Ford and Gordon Foster to illegal offshore accounts and shadow companies. The money trail led straight to them, like an invisible thread woven through the financial web that David had constructed. Every document, every phone call, every transaction pointed back to the two men who had betrayed him. But it wasn't just the financials that mattered. They needed witnesses, people who could testify, people who had seen what David and Foster had done behind closed doors. Ethan had a few people in mind: former employees, associates, anyone who had been close to David in the past. But convincing them to speak out against David and Foster was going to be a challenge. "We need to go public," Sarah said one evening, her voice calm but firm. "Once we have the proof, we can't sit back and wait for them to cover their tracks. We expose them, immediately." Ethan hesitated. "It's risky. They'll fight back. They'll bury us in lawsuits and lies." Sarah nodded. "That's why we need to strike first. We can't give them a chance to spin their narrative. We've got one shot at this." Ethan understood the gravity of her words. If they went public, there would be no turning back. The media would descend on Harris Investments like vultures, and David and Foster would do everything in their power to discredit them. But if they succeeded, if they exposed the truth, everything David had worked for would crumble. "You're right," Ethan said, his voice steady now. "We have to do this. It's the only way." That evening, they met with Vlasov. He handed Ethan a USB drive filled with the latest findings: audio recordings, financial documents, and video footage from surveillance cameras that showed David and Foster meeting in private, discussing their plan to destroy Harris Investments. Every word, every gesture was captured. It was irrefutable. "This is it," Vlasov said. "With this, you can bring them down, but you'll need to act fast. They'll realize someone's closing in on them." Ethan nodded, feeling a cold wave of determination wash over him. He had his proof. Now it was time to set the stage. The pieces were all in place. He had the evidence. He had the witnesses. The only thing left was to expose David and Foster for the criminals they were. Ethan knew there was no turning back. The fight for his company was on, and this time, he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. The press conference was set. Ethan sat at the head of a polished conference table in his office, his hands resting on its cool surface. The room was filled with a tense silence, and the faint hum of city traffic outside seemed distant compared to the storm brewing within the walls of Harris Investments. Everything had led to this moment. The evidence was irrefutable. David Ford and Gordon Foster had been caught red-handed, their secrets laid bare. Every transaction, every shady deal had been documented, captured in video, audio, and financial records. The truth was undeniable. Sarah stood beside Ethan, her expression unreadable but resolute. Jake was sitting in the corner, watching the proceedings carefully, his eyes darting between the screens and the people in the room. They all knew that once the press saw the evidence, there would be no turning back. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just about saving his company. It was about justice. It was about exposing the lies and deceit that had poisoned the very core of his world. The press conference began. Cameras flashed and reporters murmured, their questions ready and their pens poised. But Ethan didn't speak immediately. He wanted them to hear this clearly. He wanted the world to understand. "I'm Ethan Harris, CEO of Harris Investments," he began, his voice steady but carrying a weight of determination. "I've called you here today not to defend my company, but to expose the corruption that has infected it." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, but Ethan didn't waver. He gestured to the large screen behind him, where a video feed flickered to life. The footage revealed David Ford and Gordon Foster speaking privately, their conversation filled with conspiratorial whispers about bringing Harris Investments to its knees. The words were clear, the tone unmistakable. "As you can see," Ethan continued, his voice growing sharper, "these men, my former partner, David Ford, and my biggest competitor, Gordon Foster, colluded to destroy Harris Investments, to take what wasn't theirs and leave nothing behind." The room fell silent. The reporters watched the footage, transfixed by the undeniable proof of the betrayal. Ethan's gaze flicked briefly to Sarah, who stood beside him, her expression unchanged. But there was a flicker in her eyes, pride maybe, or relief. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The video ended, and the room was filled with the sound of clicking cameras and murmurs of disbelief. The evidence was irrefutable. David and Foster had no way out. Ethan took a breath, his chest heavy. I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people. But today the truth comes to light. No longer will my company or anyone else be subject to lies and manipulation. David Ford and Gordon Foster have caused irreparable damage to Harris Investments, but their corruption ends today. A reporter raised their hand. What's next, Mr. Harris? Will Harris Investments survive this scandal? Ethan's gaze was steady, unwavering. We will rebuild, he said firmly. The road ahead is long, but it starts with the truth. And from here on out, we'll make sure that the people who betrayed us, who betrayed me, will never hold power again. As the press conference ended, Ethan walked out of the room with Sarah and Jake by his side. He knew the battle wasn't over. The press would tear them apart, lawsuits would follow, and the fallout would be brutal. But he also knew something else. He wasn't alone anymore. He had allies, and together they would rebuild what had been lost. Outside, the city's skyline stretched out before him, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The storm had only just begun, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. The war had been won, but the real work, the work of rebuilding and making things right, was only just beginning.